Ngayon naman, pag-aaralan natin ay finding the limit using the graph of the function. So kung yung last lesson natin ay finding the limit using table of values, ngayon naman ay using graph of the function. So consider the graph shown sa ating screen. And we are going to determine the following given limits of a function. That is, limits of f of x as x approaches to -3, limits of x as f of x as x approaches to -1, and until limits of f of x as x approaches to 5. So, looking at the graph, kung titignan natin yung graph natin, nag-focus tayo doon sa first example natin, which is limit of f of x as x approaches to -3. In evaluating the graph to find the limits, kinakailangan natin again to consider the left and the right hand limit of our function. Dito naman sa graph, we need to consider the left part of your graph and the right part of your graph based on our constant, which is -3. So, ang magiging basis natin dito is si -3. So, andito yung -3 natin. Here is your -3. So, this part is your -3. So, tingnan natin, as the graph from the left approaches to -3, saan nag-approach yung limit natin? So, nag-approach siya dito kay 1. And as the graph from the right of -3 ay nag-approach doon, so -3, nag-approach pa rin siya dito kay 1. So, ibig sabihin na nito, if yung graph natin ay nag-approach with the same value, ibig lang sabihin nito, the limits of our function is equal to 1. So, yun yung nagiging basis natin. The both left and right graph based on our constant, which is -3. On the other hand, like for example, we have the next example. We have -1. As the value of your x approaches to -1. So, this is your -1. Again, we need to consider the left and the right graph ng ating given constant. So, i-determine natin. So, as the value of your x approaches to -1 from the left, ito yan, yung nandito sa side na to, ito, from the left, ay nag-a-approach siya into 1. Ito yun. Nag-a-approach siya into 1. And on the other hand, from the right naman, simula dito pupunta doon, nag-a-approach naman siya dito kay 3. So, ibig sabihin lang ito, we have the left hand limit as 1 and we have the right hand limit as 3. And based on our previous lesson or discussion, sabi natin kapag magkaiba ang left hand and right hand limit, ibig sabihin the limit does not exist. So, ibig sabihin nito, it does not exist. So, the limit of our function does not exist at -1. Now, let's go back with, let's have the next example. Limits of f of x as x approaches to 1. So, ang 1 natin ay this one. Nandito ang 1 natin. And as the value of your x approaches to 1, ito yon, the value of your f of x approaches to -1. So, we have here -1. And on the right side, we have here also approaching to -1. So, ibig sabihin nito, the limits of our function f of x as x approaches to 1 is equal to -1. So, na-approach sila with the same value, and that is -1. Unlike yung b natin, nag-approach sila with a different value, yung isa ay 1, yung isa ay 3. So, they don't have the same left hand and right hand limit, kaya the function or the limits of your function does not exist. So we have here 3. The value of x approaches to 3, and this is your 3. Ayan. And from the left, ito yun. So, papunta siya dun sa taas, and kung makita natin, ito siya. So, nasa 3. At yung right side naman, ito yun. At kung makita natin, dito siya sa 0. So, we have 2 different values, 0 and 3. So, ibig sabihin lang nun, kung may magkaiba tayong value of our limits, ibig sabihin, the limits of our function does not exist. And for the last part, letter E, so we have here at 5. So, this is your 5. As the value of your x approaches to 5, ayan, from the left. So, andito tayo. So, that is at 5 then also. So, we have here from the left, approaching siya sa 5, and from the right naman, approaching siya sa 5 then. So, we have here the limits of your function as x approaches to 5 is equal to 5. That's how we get the limits of your function kapag ang given lang ay graph of the function. So, ganito natin siya kinukuha or determine yung limits of our function. So, syempre, dapat nandun yung ating constant value. Ito yung 3, negative 1, 1, 3, and 5 para ma-determine natin kung saan nag-a-approach yung ating limits. So, let's take another example. So, we have here the limits of our function. We have limits of our function as x approaches to negative 5. So, negative 5, ito, dito yung negative 5. So, ibig sabihin, ito yon yung unshaded region dito sa, unshaded circle dito sa left side. So, again, ganun pa rin. We need to determine the left part of the graph and the right part of the graph. So, ito yon from the left, dito na bumula, punta doon. Ayan, so nag-approach siya dito. Around 2.5, ayan. So, 2.5 siya nag-approach. As well as, yung right hand graph natin, yung right graph natin, ay nag-approach din into 2.5. So, ibig sabihin, the value of, the limits of our function is equal to 2.5. So, limits of function as x approaches to negative 1.5, that is 2.5. Next is, we have the limits of our function as x approaches to 0. So, again, as x approaches to 0, dito yan, from the left, nag-a-approach siya sa 1. From the left, nag-a-approach siya sa 1. While from the right, nandito yan, nag-a-approach siya sa 0. So, we have 2 different limits. So, ibig sabihin, the limits of our function does not exist for letter B. Letter C, we have limits of f of x as x approaches to 2. So, nasaan yung 2 natin? Ito yung 2. Ayan, ito yung 2 natin. So, again, we need to consider the left part of the graph as well as the right part of the graph. So, we have here, ito approaching to 0. Yung limits natin. And we have here, approaching also to 0. So, ibig sabihin, the limits of our function is equal to 0. Next is the limits of our function as x approaches to 4. Ito yan. Dito, from the left, approaching to 0. Yung first limit natin ay approaching to 0, while the second limit natin is approaching to negative 2. So, again, we have different value of our limit. Ibig sabihin, the limits does not exist for this example. So, sometimes, in a graph, makikita lang natin ay yung ordered pair ng graph natin. Makikita lang natin ay ordered pair ng graph natin. Like, for example, gamitin na rin natin itong graph na to. Like, for example, this one. We have negative 2 and 4, or the ordered pair. Itong part na to. We have negative 2 and 4. So, in determining the limits of our function, yung x value natin or yung x coordinate natin ang siyang nagiging value of our constant. While yung y natin siyang nagiging value ng ating limits. That's why we can rewrite this one. Kapag ordered pair lang ang given we can rewrite this one as limits of our function as x approaches 2. Sabi natin ang constant mo ay yung ating x variable or x coordinate. So we have negative 2 which is equal to, ang limits natin ay 4. That's how we write the limits of our function. So, ganyan natin kinukuha yung limits of function kapag ang given ay ordered pair. Or, madali rin naman kahit sa graph, makikita rin natin gamit ito. Part na to, na graph. Ayan. So, that's how we get the limits of your function. Another one, let's consider this one. Negative 1 and 2. So, since negative 1 natin ay nasa x, ibig sabihin siya yung magiging constant. Tapos yung 2, siya yung magiging limit. So, we can write this one as limits of f of x. As x approaches t, your constant is 1, ay negative 1. And then, your limits is equal to 2. So, we have this as your answer. And that is how we find the limits of our function using graph. Thank you for listening sa lesson natin for today and hope natuto tayo sa napag-aralan natin sa araw na ito. Maraming salamat and goodbye sa inyong lahat.